Good morning. I'm Sana, and you're listening to Let's Grab Coffee on WYXR 91.7 FM. Every Monday morning, I'm joined by experts from around the world who are investigating our most pressing social issues and common curiosities. Over the next hour, you'll learn about their inspirations, motivations, and of course, what they know about the world around us. So grab that cup of coffee and get ready for a fun and insightful conversation. As many of you know, I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee, a city famously and infamously known for its history of Black-white relations. And while folks from China have been in the Memphis area for over 150 years, Asian Americans currently only make up about 2% of our local population and less than 1% when I was growing up. I rarely saw people who looked like me, and I learned very little Asian American history in school. It was difficult for me to know where I belonged or if I belonged at all. As it turns out, this is a very common Asian American experience. This morning, I'm joined by Dr. Julia Lee, the author of Biting the Hand, Growing Up Asian in Black and White America. In it, she talks more about the Asian American experience of rage, of shame, but also how we can turn those feelings into positive social change and connections among and between one another. Dr. Julia Lee is a Korean American writer, scholar, and teacher. She is the author of Our Gang, A Racial History of the Little Rascals, and The American Slave Narrative and the Victorian Novel, as well as the novel By the Book, which is published under the pen name Julia Sanborn. Julia received her PhD in English and American Language and Literature from Harvard University, and she is currently an associate professor of English at Loyola Marymount University, where she teaches Black and Asian American literature. She has also written for The Atlantic, The Huffington Post, and Zocalo Public Square. Good morning, Julia. Thanks so much for joining us.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
Yes, as soon as I saw the title of this book, Biting the Hand, Growing Up Asian in Black and White America, I was completely hooked. And I knew I had to read this book and hopefully have you as a guest on the show because just the title itself just spoke so much to me. So I am beyond excited that we're able to have this conversation today.
Thank you. I mean, that's really what I was hoping was that, when I came out with this book, that readers would see themselves or feel like, oh my gosh, finally a book that is speaking to things that I have been feeling or, um, you know, conf- trying to figure out for myself. So thanks for having me on.
Yes. I mean, and that is exactly what this book does. At first, I definitely feel seen in these pages and just that power of seeing yourself in a story. And so that definitely resonated with me. And in so many of the different anecdotes throughout the book, I was like, oh yeah, like I was like right there with you. And so just thank you so much for writing this. And as you even kind of say in the book, like writing ourselves into history.
Yeah, one of the things that I had to continue to remind myself while I was writing is continuing to remind myself who the ideal reader was, because I think so often, especially when you are raised in this country where the default is usually a white person or a white reader or a white audience, you unwittingly write to that person. And so much of the time I had to remind myself, no, 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 don't write to that default reader, write to the person like yourself who hasn't been centered and who hasn't seen themselves being addressed.
Mm-hmm.
So that, I mean, it's sad to say that it was more difficult to do than I thought it would be, because I think, again, all of us have been so indoctrinated and so brainwashed, really, that
Mm-hmm.
it's so easy to slip into the way we've been trained to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. I love throughout the book, you use different Korean words and there's no explanation, right? Like readers can either Google it or use the context clues to understand what it is that you're referring to. So even small things like that, I think, speak to exactly what you're talking about. Like, who is the ideal reader? If your ideal reader is other Asian Americans, other Korean Americans, there are certain words that you wouldn't have to explain because there is that shared knowledge.
Yes. I mean, that's something that I learned from other writers who have done something similar. Writers who come from Spanish speaking families and won't gloss or won't define Spanish words because the way they speak to their families or to their friends is intermixing both English and Spanish words. And I just thought that that was so refreshing and so wonderful because, it is a common language. And, what does it take for somebody, if they are not familiar with the word, to just Google it, just take a second and do that little bit of extra work that those of us who are people of color always have to do that extra work. So for
Mhm.
once, you do the extra work. So yeah,
Right.
so it was important for me not to italicize a lot of those words either, because I didn't want them to seem quote unquote foreign,
Mhm.
because they're not foreign to somebody like me.
Yeah. And I love that idea because foreign to whom? Right. And
Hmm.
that's also something you talk about in the book, particularly around Asian American invisibility. And you ask this question, invisible to whom? And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that idea of visibility and invisibility as it relates to Asian Americans.
Yeah, I think that Asian Americans, so many of us feel like we exist in this place of almost existential invisibility that, we're not really counted as people of color sometimes. It's like, oh, well, you're not black, you're not brown, you fall in this no man's land. And at the same time, you're not white. You may be white adjacent and enjoy some privileges of being adjacent to whiteness, but we are still clearly visibly different. And as you can see through this spate of anti-Asian hate, our adjacency to whiteness is not going to protect us from being hate crimed.
Hmm.
So it's hard because you feel like you don't know what camp you belong into, and so you're just forgotten or further marginalized. And I used to rage against that sense of invisibility and always want to speak up, but felt like I was being quieted, not just by American culture, but by my own Korean culture,
Hmm.
which values, harmony and don't cause a stink and just try to fall into line. But there was a quote by Toni Morrison that I refer to in my book about, how invisibility is really a matter of context, that, yeah, some people can't see me, but a lot of people can see me and we see each other. And so I have to focus on that and flick off, the white person looking over my shoulder or telling me that I don't count, just flick him off my shoulder and then I'm free
Hmm.
because he may not see me, but a lot of other people can see me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love through this book that you're helping others be seen, continue that process of seeing, but also to feel as though you are seen. What I really enjoyed about the book is how you weave in a lot of different current events, but also historical events, which I think are important in helping Asian Americans to be seen both among one another, right? Because there's a lot of Asian American history that we as Asian Americans don't learn, let alone Black and white Americans. So I also really appreciated you bringing in some key events to help situate some of the different experiences you are having kind of in this broader context. Because, like you said, that context piece really matters. As I was reading through your book, I was thinking about the context in which I grew up in, right? So we're thinking about Memphis, a very Black, white city. And so, again, just not feeling very seen or not feeling very visible. And so I really resonated with those stories in which people were seeing you through a very narrow lens and the ways that you were able to fight back.
Yeah, no, I think it's really true. I mean, you know, a lot of the reason why I write about, the Asian American context, historical context, is because I was learning it as I wrote as well, because, I didn't take an Asian American lit class until graduate school, really. And I didn't get any exposure really to Asian American history growing up. And so
Mhm.
part of me was piecing it together on my own through my own reading and later on through some classes and just self-education. And I know so many of my peers, people my age, I'm, in my 40s, and so many of us, if we didn't have the luxury of taking an Asian American studies class in, say, college, don't have any idea really of the history of Asians in America. We might have a little bit more access to African American history, and that is such an important and pivotal history to this country. But not being able to figure out where we fit in the context of that history, I think is a loss for all of us. I think I, as well, like showing how the Asian American movement was so indebted to the Black Power movement, and how really from its inception, it's always been in cooperation and in solidarity with one another. And so seeing what we're trying to do now with in terms of Asian American visibility, that it's not a separate thing, that it is in collaboration and in solidarity with our fellow peoples of color.
Absolutely. And that was something else that I really appreciate about your book, was that you continue to tell that story and give those historical but also contemporary examples of interracial cooperation, of multiracial solidarity. Again, a story that is often glossed over, a history that is often not fully told, for very specific reasons, right? We can think about all the ways in which the white supremacist culture that we live in would not want us to know that history of interracial cooperation and solidarity. So I like that you pulled in all those different examples as well throughout the book. When you're talking about how oftentimes as Asian Americans, or just Americans broadly, we don't learn Asian American history, but we often do learn a lot about Black history, and often seeing ourselves through those joint struggles or through even similar struggles. So I like how throughout the book, you're also nodding to different Black authors that really helped form kind of your sense of voice and also your perspective in this country. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about some of those writers that were really pivotal to how you were thinking through maybe this book, but also kind of in coming to an Asian American consciousness.
Yeah, I really am so indebted to inspired by African American writers. I ended up working on a dissertation in graduate school that talked or that focused a lot on Frederick Douglass and these early slave narrators, slave narrative writers, and how they basically, wrote their way to freedom, wrote their way into existence with their slave narratives. And I always found these accounts by Black writers to finally put into words the kind of alienation, isolation, marginalization, and anger that I felt. Certainly there's been an explosion in Asian American writings more recently, but when I was growing up, there really wasn't a lot, and the little that there was fell into this, kind of digestible, more easily digestible kind of immigrant assimilation narrative. And I could not find words for the frustration and rage I felt, except when I read somebody like James Baldwin, or except when I read something by Toni Morrison. I mean, some of these great, great writers, and they were talking about specific historical trauma that faced Black Americans from enslavement to the present. And even though that was not my particular history, I could so identify with the feelings of invisibility and anger at not being part of this so-called American dream and being villainized or scapegoated. And so, growing up when I was 15, I grew up in Los Angeles, and that was when the LA uprising, the LA riots occurred. And that became a really critical moment in my development, because this was a moment where in the media, especially I think on the West Coast, really suggested it was a Black Korean conflict, which suddenly made me feel like, but wait a second, these Black writers who I found so profound, you're telling me that Korean Americans are being pitted against them, and actually we're enemies, that we're not on the same side. And that triggered a real moment of crisis for me, because where did I belong? I am absolutely Korean. My face is Korean. My parents were liquor store and then fried chicken restaurant owners whose store was burned in the LA uprising. And yet I very much empathized with the situation of Black Americans and the anti-Black hatred that they were facing. So part of the next several decades of my life was just trying to figure out, why are we being pitted against each other when really we are allies? And as you mentioned, I mean, the discovery I made was that this is that white supremacist sleight of hand that is trying to fool us into seeing one another as adversaries rather than as allies. I mean, we have to stand together, because otherwise that's how, we're divided and then we fall, we lose. So we have to stand together.
Absolutely. We have to stand together. You know, as you were talking about some of the writers that really inspired you or that gave you a lens to understand your own experience, um, it made me think too of being, in high school. And I think a friend of mine gave me or was reading this book of like African American literature. And I think it was poetry. And I
Mhm.
remember reading the works of Donnell Lee and really feeling that same like, wow, okay, somebody else feels this way, or there's a language for this, or, people are already thinking through this because I didn't have, there wasn't a large Asian American population in my city. Of course, we're not learning Asian American history in school. And so to have, again, that language through poetry, through the words of Black writers was also very crucial to my own development as well.
Mhm.
In the book, you say to be an Asian person in this country and to be relatively conscious is to be in a state of shame almost all of the time. Of course, an homage to James Baldwin's to be a Negro in this country and to be relatively conscious is to be in a rage almost all the time. But I'm wondering if you could talk more about shame. One section of your book is even headlined under this title of shame. Could you talk about that in regards to the Asian American experience?
Yeah, the book opens with a section that's called rage and anger is something that, is so easy for me to articulate. I think it's something that all of us can identify with. The second section, which is like the messy middle, where you're trying to figure out, okay, now what do I do with these feelings? I think shame is I would argue one of the most difficult emotions to come to grips with because again, shame is something you want to hide and you don't want to talk about. And one of the things I mention is that shame is this fear of disconnection. It's feeling that you are alone, that you are an outcast, that no one else feels this way. And I think that Asian Americans, again, the experience of being Asian American in this country is to constantly feel one is in a state of shame because nobody else can identify with you. You're not visible. You don't belong to Black. You don't belong to white. Nobody, we don't have this mass awareness, and therefore we fall through the gaps. And, I also push against, the stereotype that, oh, well, Asians, they suffer from shame because they're such a collective culture. And that's why, I had a therapist who once told me, the reason why you're so, unhappy or depressed or anxious is because you've always been shamed by your mother. And I remember just pushing up against that and being like, dude, that's too easy. That's just too glib a way of interpreting or explaining why I feel the way I do. Because the truth is that to be an Asian person in this country is to be shamed by American culture. I mean, it's not just my parents who are shaming me, it's our entire society that, mocks us in jokes or makes fun of our accents or tells us that we're the easy butt of, everybody can clown on Asian people and it's no big deal. I mean, why do you think so many of us are so filled with shame? And then even, seeing connections with like the experience of Black Americans can be an experience of intense shame because certainly we understand that we did not have the long and tortured history of Black Americans in this country. And we do not want to presume that we know what that's like. And so we also feel disconnected there, sort of like, oh, I'm ashamed because I know my experience is not the Black experience, and therefore I cannot speak about it. I cannot articulate my own racial pain and shame. But yeah, I mean, writing the book was a way to pierce through that veil of shame and to be like, no, 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 I know there are other people out there who feel the way I do, and that we should not feel ashamed because
Mhm.
there are a lot of us in this situation.
Yeah. I mean, what you said about that feeling of shame, those feelings of disconnection, feelings of something is wrong with me, that I'm inherently bad. And again, like so many of us feel that way because of the way race and racism are constructed in our society, not because of something that we've done or something that we haven't done. But if we don't understand that historical context and then how it's playing out today, then we can start to internalize that individually and feel like, it's me, right? It's not the system, but that it is actually something that's wrong with me.
Yeah. And
Uh,
that's how shame works, is that you internalize it. Like all the anger I felt, I was like, well, I'm not allowed to feel this anger. People say I shouldn't be angry, that I'm lucky to be in this country and I'm lucky I'm not treated as badly as Black Americans. And therefore I need to internalize. And then you turn it within, and then you find yourself just falling apart inside because you have no outlet, no
mhm.
method of expression. And yeah, I mean, that's how racism works. It makes you think you're the problem, not the system.
Mm, yeah. Let's take a quick break, but when we come back, we'll get more into how you work through these feelings of shame. This is Let's Grab Coffee on WYXR 91.7 FM. You're listening to Let's Grab Coffee on WYXR 91.7 FM. I'm Sana, and we are here this morning chatting with Dr. Julia Lee, author of Biting the Hand, Growing Up Asian in Black and White America. Now, Julia, before the break, we were talking about this feeling of shame. That's often a key shared experience of being Asian in America. But I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about how you started working through this shame.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it was a long, long process. And in many ways, I'm still working through it because
Hmm.
it's so easy to fall back into that sense of humiliation or embarrassment. Um, I mean, I think that, as I said, shame is the fear of disconnection. So the more you can connect with others and find empathy, find others who have experienced the same thing you have and who can voice it and, hold your hand or just say, I hear you, I see you. I mean, for me, it's been about finding colleagues and friends and even now readers. I mean, I can't tell you how heartwarming it is to get emails from readers who I've never met before, but who tell me, I read your book and I went through the exact same thing. And now I feel like I'm not alone. So that's a huge step out of racial shame. The other thing that I have found really useful is something that one of my friends, who is a Black feminist scholar and professor, she was talking to me on the phone and was telling me that she had a Chinese American graduate student who came to her office hours and was really apologetic and full of shame because she said that, when she was growing up in Florida, that she and her friends all wished that they were white. And she felt so horrible about this. And my friend stopped her and said, no, 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 no. You did not want to be white. Nobody wants to be white. You wanted to be human. And when my friend said this to me over the phone, I really had to take a deep breath because this was something that I'd always been so ashamed of, is that I had tried so hard to assimilate into whiteness and to be white. And my friend was telling me, no, you should not be ashamed of that. What you were trying to do was you wanted to be human. And in this
Mhm.
country, sadly, because we live in a white supremacist country, the only people who get to experience the fullness of humanity are white people. And so you didn't want to be white, you wanted to be human. You wanted to be treated like white people got to be treated. And when she made that clear to me, I just thought, wow, I suddenly felt this release of so many years of shame. It wasn't that I was, embarrassed or ashamed of being Korean or ashamed of not being white. It was just that I had that very human desire to be treated like a human being, and it wasn't my fault.
Hmm. Yeah, and this is one of the anecdotes that you do share in the book. And when I read that, I even had to write in the margins of my book some
Yeah.
expletives that I won't say on the air. But yes, that feeling of like, wow, like this is it. Like this is exactly it, that we have a desire to be human, to be seen as human, to experience the full range of emotions and abilities and freedoms and rights and responsibilities as human beings. And in this country that is historically and continually through whiteness. And we can
Yeah.
think about how citizenship has been established in this country, and how Asian Americans have been firmly outside of who could be considered a citizen, to see that historical connection. But again, that idea of it's not that people want to be white, it's that people want those privileges and freedoms that have been historically and continue to be associated with whiteness.
Whiteness. Yeah. No,
Yeah.
it's, I think, a huge burden lifted off my shoulders because, you know, and it has allowed me not just to forgive myself, but also forgive other people that I see who, it's easy. I talk about how as a kid, I would just denigrate, Asian American, other people of color who I felt like just were trying to be white or were whitewashed or were, just pathetic and wannabe. And now I feel like now that I'm older, I'm able to pause and be like, okay, I may not like the way that they, treat other people of color or the way they chase certain markers of whiteness or the status that comes with whiteness, but I also have to forgive them because they too are trying to survive in a system in which they are dehumanized. They too are trying to be human in the only way they know how. And that has helped a lot with my sense of anger, and bitterness, because I realized that I was doing the same thing and therefore I need to forgive myself as well.
That's so powerful. Like that self-forgiveness.
Yeah, that's
You know,
huge.
yeah. I mean, you even spoke earlier about um, having empathy for others as a way to combat, feelings of shame, that fear of disconnection. And I think your book really does that so well in showing your own journey into, releasing this shame, also, questioning your perspective and what you have known to be true.
Mhm.
And that's what I really liked about this book. I felt like you were so transparent in these pages of times when you had been judging other people or times when you had, been doing things that you're like, wow, I see now because of the context in which I grew up in, because of white supremacy. I understand why I was thinking that way. And I can identify like that's not how I want to continue to think or behave. But to offer us that transparency and that vulnerability, I think is such a gift as readers continue in their own journey of self-forgiveness, but also, creating more connections with other people too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that I joke about how like nobody hates me more than me, right? Like I'm a perfectionist, I'm an overachiever. I was like trained to be this way by my parents and by their immigrant work mentality, but also by a country that has taught me that, you have to be twice as good and you have to work twice as hard in order to get half as far. And so I've absorbed all this. And at a certain point, you'll just burn out or you'll flame out or you'll just be, broken physically or mentally. So it's just not sustainable. And one of the things I realized, especially, I have children now, I have a 10-year-old and a 13-year-old, and it was really difficult during COVID, watching the ways in which they kind of circled the drain, emotionally, psychologically, like so many people in this country. And it was a moment of recognition for me that I had to stop treating myself so harshly as well, because my kids see it, my students see it. They're like, wow, like if I ever messed up, I just told myself I was garbage, right? And
Mhm.
it's like, oh my God. But in many ways, that was a way in which I started internalizing white supremacy myself. Like I didn't even need somebody to tell me, you suck, right? I was telling that to myself every day because that is what I had taught, I had learned I had to do in order to be seen as human, was to be superhuman. And to realize that I didn't even need like some, person out there telling me I suck, that I could just do it to myself, was the moment that I was like, oh dear, this is so deep and so intense. And what I want my kids and my students to know is that no, you're allowed to be human. You are allowed to be imperfect. You don't have to be twice as good and work twice as hard, because I love you and you are human and you don't have to be superhuman in order to be loved and in order to be treated as a human being. You just, no, you are entitled to humanity.
Yes, you're entitled to humanity. I think that's an important reminder because we can forget, right? You talk about in the book of this like being brainwashed, right? And becoming disconnected from your own humanity. And in one of the anecdotes that you mentioned, it was actually about Sandra Oh, who I
Mhm.
absolutely love. And when I think about, when did I first feel seen, on screen, it was her character, Christina Yang in Grey's Anatomy, where I was like, oh, it's an Asian American woman, like me, who is feisty and twisted, right? Like, and also, has a career and is very focused on that. And, in it, you talk about how she was reading the part for Killing Eve, another great series, right? And how she was confused as to what part, she was supposed to be reading for, that she never could have fathomed that she was reading for the lead. And so just speaking about like being brainwashed, and you say in an industry infamous for rejection, O had protected herself by not allowing herself to imagine possibilities that had historically been foreclosed to her.
Right. It was a survival mechanism. And I remember when I heard that story, and I heard her on Fresh Air, I think as well, with what is her name? Um, well, whatever. I listened to her on Fresh Air, and she was telling this story and about how shocked she was. And yeah, you could tell there was also some shame there, that she had been so brainwashed by her own marginalization, that she couldn't even imagine herself in the main role of this series. And I remember she had internalized the white gaze, because you have to internalize the white gaze if you're going to survive as a person of color in this society. And so she's in film and television, incredibly white industry. And so to survive, she had to internalize how the white world saw her. And she always knew that the white world saw her as a secondary or tertiary character, the sidekick. And so, I think there was a sense of shame, like, I can't believe how brainwashed I was. But, I wanted to reach out through the radio, when I heard her interview, and say, it was not your fault. You did this to survive. The culture taught you to see yourself as a minor character. And how sad is that, that you're indoctrinated into thinking you're a minor character in your own life? I mean,
Mm.
that's devastating. So I'm glad, and I think that was a moment of awakening and recognition for her.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's so powerful to hear that, right? That idea or that confession of like, I couldn't even imagine myself in that role, because I think it does speak to something that we do feel as Asian Americans or even folks of color, where you have relegated yourself in certain ways to that secondary role and not even imagining certain possibilities. I'm wondering for you, as an academic, were there similar ways that you maybe reflect back and think of, oh wow, I wasn't even imagining certain possibilities for me because of the history of, the discipline or the history of academia, or maybe in some other area in your life where now you realize like, wow, there are certain ways that I wasn't even allowing myself to imagine.
Yeah, I think it's so, yeah, like damaging, because I think that I think representation is important, more important than, people might even realize, because if you don't see it, you can't imagine it. I mean, I think all of us are kind of literal thinkers in that way, especially when you're a kid. You don't see yourself on television. You can't imagine yourself on television. I mean, I grew up in LA, and one of the stories in my book is about how, I totally wanted to be a child actor, right? Like, I watched all those stupid sitcoms, and I thought I was going to be Punky Brewster, and and yet I very early on I was like, wow, nobody looks like me on TV. And that's because nobody wants to look at somebody like me, and I have no role, and the only roles that are available to me are, the comic sidekick or the joke. And so, I mean, my mother would have disowned me if I became an actor or actress, which is why I have so much respect for all these Asian American actors who went against family disapproval to pursue their dream. But I had disqualified myself from even those professions, because I thought, who wants to look at me? Nobody. And so I think a lot of Asian Americans, and along with, some family pressures or families concerned that, certain fields are more welcoming to us than others, it's why we're pushed into more technical fields. fields where there is larger amounts of Asian representation, or where, our face is not going to be an impediment in the way that it is in terms of like acting and things like that. I mean, I really wanted to be a writer. I mean, that was always my dream. Well, actually, I wanted to be a ballet dancer. But again, similar situation. I'm like, I don't really see any Asian American ballet dancers. I mean, there are some more now, but it's also a very white industry or profession. And so, you know, I always loved writing, but I definitely saw that there was a certain kind of story that the publishing industry wanted to see out of an Asian American writer.
Mm.
And I also didn't have any real, what do you call it? Like role models, I mean, I think growing up, the only one I could think of was the Joy Luck Club.
Yeah, Amy Tan.
Amy Tan was really the only one. And then, her movie came out and it was like, oh my gosh, this is a huge step for Asian American representation. And then nothing
Nothing.
for decades. Right. And, as a young person, you're not stupid. You're watching this and you're like, okay, well, that's not going to work. That's not going to work. And, I was also an immigrant kid. So it was very much like, you need to start making money. You need to start paying back your student loans. You need to start supporting your parents because they don't have a retirement fund. You're the retirement fund. And so, you find yourself pushed into certain professions, ones that make money, ones that have job security, ones that have health insurance. I mean, I realized so much of my book is about just looking for health insurance and taking jobs just for the health insurance. So yeah, I mean, I went into academia because I thought that it was a way to write while also being paid and getting health insurance. And I hadn't realized just how difficult it is to get a job as an academic. And then I also was naive about academia being itself much like other systems of power in this country. I thought, oh, a group of people who are motivated by like intellectual pursuits and the pursuit of knowledge would be more open-minded and inclusive. And actually, no, they're just like other systems of power. And for a long time, I felt like they were not going to let me in. I could not get a job. I did not feel like I was wanted. I was constantly being told that the things I was interested in, specifically race and literature, were unimportant or not rigorous. So that was, I mean, I still sometimes feel like it's a miracle that I have a job. I mean, it's a miracle I was able to publish this book.
Yeah. I mean, so many things that you just said. I'm like, so many questions now, because, being an academic as well, also specializing in race and ethnicity, you said something rigorous, right? This idea that your work isn't rigorous, which is that code word for it's not the status quo, right?
Yes.
And so, for scholars of color, rigorous is a word that we know very well.
It is a dog whistle word, rigorous and also objective. Those are the two words that seem like they're not, they're color blind words, but they're very loaded words. And it usually means, you don't meet a so-called objective, meaning white standard. So I get like a rash every time people use those terms around me.
Yeah, absolutely. Because like you said, those are dog whistle words in academia, ways to exclude people, ways to devalue their work. And I was kind of laughing, when you said like, oh, people who are interested in ideas and intellectual pursuits, surely this will be,
I
like
know.
a
So
safer
naive.
space.
I know. And it's just, I mean, it's so bad. And it's almost worse because these people think that they're so enlightened and brilliant. And it's like, no, you're actually just as bad. Right.
Yes. And I'm in sociology. So I mean,
Oh, I'm sure, right? You guys are like the rigorous social science, right? Like I'm in like English. It's like,
Yeah, so I'm like, I just felt you so much when you said that. But something else that you do mention in the book is like also releasing yourself from these standards of academic writing, right? Deciding that you're going to write a book like Biting the Hand, right? Or even write whatever else you might write it in a way where it's like, okay, who is my audience? What are the words that I would use? What is the tone that I would use in my writing? And detaching yourself from kind of these academic standards. And I see more scholars of color, using the voice that they're most comfortable with in their writing. And even the books that I've seen kind of recently come out written by scholars of color that are, again, saying like, the audience that I want to talk to isn't the academic audience, isn't necessarily a white audience. Like I want to talk to folks who have experienced the world like I've experienced it. And so I'm actually very excited to see more scholars of color, particularly, use the voice and write in the voice in which they want to.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's also so elitist and exclusive, is this idea that, you're only qualified to speak if you talk in a certain register, which again has historically been used to exclude the most marginalized people. And, I talk about how I wanted to write a book that my parents could read and that my students could read and that my friends could read, because I have a lot of friends who are not in academia. And honestly, I hate reading academic writing. I think it's so boring and so opaque.
Soulless.
Oh, totally soulless. And yet, going to grad school, you're told, well, if you want to be taken seriously, this is the way you need to write. And, one of my advisors, Henry Louis Gates Jr., I mean, he writes for a public audience and he is very much a public intellectual. And I remember when I was a graduate student, sort of asking him, how he was able to do that, especially since so many of his colleagues at Harvard, were still writing in a very elitist register and did not have the reach that he did. And he was saying that, his first book was an academic literary theory book that was aimed at the intellectual elite. And he said, yeah, I wrote that book so I could get tenure. Right. Like to try to get through that gate. And then once he got tenure, he was like, I'm going to write whatever I feel like. And I remember that sense of being so impressed that, yeah, I mean, right. Like sometimes you have to write in this register or you have to write this way in order to get past certain gates, such as to get a job, such as to get tenure. But then once you have that, why not write what you want to write instead of what a certain group of people want you to write? So yeah, I hope you also join the join the group of academics who are writing for a wider audience.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Because when I think about, like my first book, I was like, oh my gosh, people read this. Don't read that. Like, that's so terrible. Like, no one read that. But the book that I have coming out next year, I did very much, I was like, I want to write the book that I would want to read. And very similar to you saying, like, this is an act of like writing myself into existence and writing folks like me into existence. And so, what is the voice that I want to use to convey that? And also, like, I want it to be readable to folks who, just might like to read, pick up a book and read it, not an academic. Because otherwise, like, who are we really talking to, right? Just like what you've done in Biting the Hand, right? Like through your writing, it's a connection, like it's a human connection. Like I felt like we were having a conversation, and those are the type of books that really help us either understand ourselves better or even understand other folks better. Not books that are written behind all of this jargon, and that are, that seem very off-putting, but rather books that invite us into a shared experience.
Yeah, it should be reciprocal. I talk a lot about reciprocity and about, consent. Like if you want to connect with other people, both people have to consent to be in that conversation, and it can't just be one-sided. I think teaching has really taught me that, because, you could be the biggest egghead in the world, and if you're boring, if you're talking in jargon, students are just going to fall asleep literally right in front of you.
Oh yeah.
And so, right. So much of, the thinking behind Biting the Hand, I first tried out a lot of these anecdotes and a lot of these lessons with my students, because I was trying to explain to them, when I talk about double consciousness, which is a phrase that W.B. Du Bois uses, and, his essay where he writes about it can seem a little bit abstract. And so I try to give examples and you really start to see the ways in which telling stories is a way of making something abstract more tangible and more understandable, because all of us have experienced that feeling of double consciousness, or this divide between how we see ourselves and then how the white world sees us. And, by teaching it to my students and giving them examples and then hearing their examples as well, I mean, I've become a better teacher. I've learned a lot more, and I wanted to aim for that same reciprocal exchange in my book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, you definitely did it. I felt like, again, like it was a conversation. So like you said, that reciprocity, that decision, that consent to like, I'm joining this conversation
Yeah.
as well. And it is an exchange. And like I said, as I was reading your book, I'm writing notes and thinking about like other examples in my own life, or even
Yeah.
just other connections, to other authors. And so I thought it was very much, that open conversation to help us understand what it's like to grow up Asian in Black and white America. Let's take another quick break. This is Let's Grab Coffee on WYXR 91.7 FM. You're listening to Let's Grab Coffee on WYXR 91.7 FM. I'm Sana, and we're here this morning with Dr. Julia Lee. She's the author of Biting the Hand, Growing Up Asian in Black and White America. Now, Julia, something that really resonated with me in the book, at the end, you're actually talking about when you sold the book, Biting the Hand. And you say, I didn't tell my parents right away. I told my friends before I told my parents. I told my sister. I told my husband's parents. I told Twitter, but I didn't tell my own parents. And I was like, okay, I feel less guilty about not telling my family about my book. And so I don't know. I was just so like, of everything else that you shared in the book, where I was like, oh, I get this. Like, oh, I had an experience like this too. And then I never expected to read this in the book, but I was like, okay, I feel way less guilty. I just got the cover art for the book, and I have shared it on Instagram. I have shared it on Twitter. I've shared it on LinkedIn. Like the pre-order link is up. I have shared it everywhere. And I haven't told my dad yet. Like I haven't told, my family yet. And yeah, so okay. So I feel
Yeah.
you.
Isn't that interesting though? It like never crossed my mind, right? It was like, why would I do that? I don't know. But I think that there is something, it's a different kind of love. It's a different kind of relationship. Even after the book came out, I would have some book events, and I didn't bother inviting my parents because I was like, why would they come? And then my sister was like, oh, do you want to invite mom? And I was like, I don't know. Because I just assumed she'd be like, I'd rather take a nap, or something. Like it's almost like just expecting that they're not going to be excited. So why even tell them?
Yeah.
Um, and but I'm almost I find a wonderful sense of connection though with my friends and with you, that we're all in that same boat where it's like, well, yeah, that's the way it goes. And our parents don't necessarily like throw a party or open up a bottle of champagne every time we bring home a good grade. Like that's not my scene. That's not the way I was raised. But there are other ways, the quiet gestures and acts of love and sacrifice that encapsulate the kind of love I have more for my parents and that my parents have for me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I think, yeah, I mean, I hear you.
Yeah, I mean, it's you mentioned those quiet acts, those, I want to say small, but not small, but just different ways that parents show their love, because you mentioned, your dad saying like, "Hey, I have extra fruit. Like, come stop by,"
Yes.
right? Like that's love, that's consideration. And so I think you writing in these very common experiences into this book does exactly what, you set out to do, which is helping folks feel more seen. I
Yeah.
imagine, reading a story that you would have liked to have been able to read when you were younger. But then also building, those connections with folks who aren't Asian American, right? To understand the Asian American experience. Because like you mentioned, just as, both of us we're finding a lens to understand our minoritized racial experience through Black authors, I can imagine for other young people of color who may not be Asian American, but find, again, that similar voice or that similarity in experience or rage or shame in this book as well.
Yeah. And I think that's, it is, the book is about the specificity of the Asian American experience. But, in the last section, I really do try to step back and broaden it to the experience of anybody who has felt marginalized or invisible or isolated, because I think there's so many of us and that we share more in common than we don't share, and that, we're more powerful, united. And so, I talk about how, like, my story is not particularly unique, right? There's actually a lot of people who are like me out there, whether they're Korean American or whether they're the kid of immigrants or whether they are somebody who has a marginalized identity that makes them feel invisible. I mean, I would hope all of them can see some commonality in our shared experiences, and a way to cross or to connect across difference, to see our common humanity.
Yeah, that is so key to see our common humanity. Well, Julia, I want to thank you so much for being here with me this morning. It is such a pleasure to chat with you. And thank you so much for writing this book.
Thank you so much for having me on your show.
Thank you again for Julia Lee for joining us this morning. She is the author of Biting the Hand, Growing Up Asian in Black and White America. I truly enjoyed reading this book. I felt like I saw so much of my own experience written into these pages. And we know how important it is to see our experiences reflected back to us, whether that is in a book or on a TV show or in a movie. And so I think people will really enjoy this book. And even if you aren't Asian American, I think it is important for us to be able to put ourselves in other folks' shoes to understand what their experience has been like. And this book gives you that opportunity to do so. Well, for today's positive note, I want to leave you with something that Julia said during the course of our conversation. She said, shame is fear of disconnection, but the more you can connect with one another, the more empathy that you can create, the more that shame and that fear can dissipate. And I love that because look, there's nothing wrong with me. There's nothing wrong with you. Shame is that feeling of there's something wrong with me, that feeling of being afraid that we can't have that connection with one another. But we can continue to connect, and we can do so through reading a book like Biting the Hand and understanding more about the Asian American experience. We can do that through having conversations with one another, and we can do that through the connections that we make here on WYXR. Well, this has been Let's Grab Coffee on WYXR 91.7 FM. I'm here every Monday morning, and I hope that you will join me again next Monday morning. And remember to subscribe in podcast format wherever you stream podcasts so you never miss a conversation.